Now, I want you to take your Bible and go to the book of Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 8. We went to the book of Psalms last week. We said that's where we were, that's where we had ended up. And we're doing a book a week, trying to find our way through the scriptures to see what it is that the scriptures reveal to us about the journey home, about our journey home together. And so we're in the book of Proverbs, and I said last week was a challenge, obviously 150 Psalms. How do you do that in 1 week? And that really is the challenge in many of the books. They're so large, how do you do it in 1 week? And there are different ways to do that, to go through an outline, to give the context, and to try to explain the theme of the book. And then sometimes just take a theme and then to illustrate it in one particular chapter. And that's what we're doing this morning here in Proverbs chapter 8. So I'm going to read the chapter, Proverbs 8, and then we'll come back and fit it in to what Proverbs is all about. Proverbs chapter 8, verse 1. Does not wisdom call and understanding lift up her voice? On top of the heights, beside the way where the paths meet, she takes her stand. And beside the gates at the opening to the city, at the entrance of the doors, she cries out, "To you, O men, I call, and my voice is to the sons of men. O naive ones, understand prudence, and O fools, understand wisdom. Listen, for I will speak noble things, and the opening of my lips will reveal right things. For my mouth will utter truth, and wickedness is an abomination to my lips. All the utterances of my mouth are in righteousness. There's nothing crooked or perverted in them. They're all straightforward to him who understands, and right to those who find knowledge. Take my instruction, and not silver, and knowledge rather than choicest gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and all desirable things cannot compare with her. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and I find knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogance, and the evil way and the perverted mouth I hate. Counsel is mine, and sound wisdom. I'm understanding. Power is mine. By me kings reign and rulers decree justice. By me princes rule, and nobles, all who judge rightly. I love those who love me, and those who diligently seek me will find me. Riches and honor are with me, enduring wealth and righteousness. My fruit is better than gold, even pure gold, and my yield better than choicest silver. I walk in the way of righteousness in the midst of the paths of justice, to endow those who love me with wealth, that I may fill their treasuries. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. From everlasting I was established, and from the beginning and from the earliest times of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills I was brought forth. While he had not yet made the earth and the fields, nor the first dust of the world. When he first established the heavens, I was there. When he inscribed a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when the springs of the deep became fixed, when he set for the sea its boundary so that the water would not transgress his command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth. Then I was beside him as a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the world his earth, and having my delight in the sons of men. Now therefore, O sons, listen to me, for blessed are they who keep my ways. Heed instruction and be wise, and do not neglect it. Blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at my doorposts. For he who finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. But he who sins against me injures himself, and all those who hate me love death. If I were to ask you what you think the theme of the book of Proverbs is, you'd say, what? Wisdom. Wisdom. Last week when we began this section of the scriptures, we talked about it being poetry, Hebrew poetry, poetic books. Job sometimes is considered one of the poetic books. We looked at Job earlier. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and the Book of Lamentations, usually grouped as the poetic books. And within that, particularly the book of Proverbs, is associated with the idea of wisdom. Now, as we think of Proverbs, there are a couple of things we want to make sure that we understand. Proverbs are axioms or maxims. That's what they are. They're sayings. We have proverbs in English. Okay, a stitch in time saves nine. Look before you leap. And I mean, you know a lot of those very pithy axioms that you say those are general observations in life. You look at and you say, look, this makes sense. This is just prudent. Okay. And so sometimes we just think of that as Proverbs, wisdom. Proverbs, though, as wisdom, is very characteristic of ancient literature. That a lot of ancient civilizations had collections of wisdom, writings of some sort, the collective wisdom that is shared for their culture. Okay? So if you think about it, the other morning with the men on Thursday morning, you said, how many of you have ever heard Confucius say? Well, what does Confucius say? That's the wisdom of Confucius, see? That the writings of Confucius are perceived as words of wisdom. If you live in Thailand or Myanmar, then you might appeal to the writings of Buddha, the way of wisdom, see? You'd listen, I have a cousin who thinks one of the wisest men on the face of the earth is the Dalai Lama. See, he's the epitome of wisdom for him. He quotes him all the time. And so you would these civilizations have these collective writings or sayings that are the wisdom sayings. In the ancient world, the Egyptians had collections of writings that were also known as the words of wisdom. Now, having said that, I don't want us to be confused to say, well, is the book of Proverbs then just like Confucius and just like Buddha or just like... no, that's not what we're saying. We're going to make some distinction. But it is very clear that it's about what constitutes wisdom. Words of wisdom. I looked at some that are considered words of wisdom. Some that are familiar. The journey of 1,000 miles starts how? With one step. Okay, Lao Tzu. It's a Chinese wisdom writing. The only wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. Socrates. The only wisdom in knowing is that you know nothing. Talent is God-given. Be humble. Fame is man-given. Be grateful. Conceit is self-given. Be careful. The Wizard of Westwood, John Wooden. I heard this one in the Philippines and never knew who said it. If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. Nelson Mandela. We were in the Philippines and earlier this year and preaching, and I preached in English, but when it came time to drive home and to make that commitment, I turned to my friend Alan and said, you do it. You do it, because now I've spoken in a language that they understand. Now you speak in their language to drive it home to the heart. Psychology today, which is known for its wisdom, defines wisdom this way. It says it can be difficult to define wisdom, but people generally recognize it when they encounter it. I don't know what it is, but I'll know it when I see it. Psychologists pretty much agree it involves an integration of knowledge, experience, and deep understanding that incorporates tolerance for the uncertainties of life as well as its ups and downs. There's an awareness of how things play out over time, and it confers a sense of balance. Now, one thing that psychology today says, it seems to embrace knowledge and experience. There seems to be this marriage of knowledge to actions, to responsibility. There's a piece that's missing, though, in psychology today's definition. Biblical wisdom has an ethical component. It is not merely knowledge shaped by experience or wrought in experience. There is a moral or an ethical component. If you read through the book of Proverbs, that becomes very, very evident. If you read through the scriptures with regards to wisdom, it is more than just knowing how to apply knowledge. There is a moral component. The book of Proverbs, many of them we know that Solomon wrote. Solomon, we're told, wrote thousands and thousands of Proverbs, and we see many of them here in the book of Proverbs. Solomon wasn't the only author. There are others who are attributed as authors. But it is a collection of the wisdom that apparently God gave to these men to be shared in the culture and with the people of Israel. Axioms, principles, they're not promises. When I say they're not promises, I quoted this morning already Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he won't depart from it. That's not a promise. Okay? I have Christians friends who are carrying guilt because maybe their child is not walking faithfully with Christ. And they said, but God, you promised me this based on this. And no, God didn't promise that. It's a principle. It's an axiom. Okay, not a promise. And so as you read through, the book of Proverbs really applies wisdom to all areas of life. And again, with a moral component, with an ethical structure to how that is played out in life. So this morning, what I want to do is just come to chapter 8 of the book of Proverbs, which talks about wisdom, and I think it's wisdom personified. We said that as one of the devices of poetry, they use lots of figures of speech. And so it's not unusual that in Hebrew poetry here we'd find personification. Now, I will tell you that there's a section of chapter 8 that many will identify and say, oh, this is speaking of Christ. And we'll get to that section. I don't think it's speaking of Christ. Okay? I think Christ certainly embodies wisdom. Paul tells us that in him is the fullness of knowledge and wisdom. That in the gospel is the wisdom of God. And so wisdom certainly is reflected in the life and the ministry and the gospel of Christ. But I don't think this section of Proverbs 8 is speaking of Christ. It's merely a personification of wisdom, where wisdom is speaking regarding itself. And so as I look through this section, what I find is this. There's an invitation. There's an invitation. Through Proverbs 8, there are a number of these invitations that are articulated. But in these invitations, what you find is that wisdom is universally available. In the first 10 verses, you see this invitation expressed in this appeal for all to come and to avail themselves of wisdom. Wisdom is at the gates. Wisdom's on the hills. Wisdom is everywhere, he says. And so is inviting people to come. And so you get to verse 4, to you, O men, I call my voice to the sons of men, to all mankind. To the fool, to the naive one, to whoever is willing to seek me can find me. That this wisdom, godly wisdom, I use the term biblical wisdom, is one that is all people are invited to avail themselves of. It's universally available. Now, why I think that's significant is this. As we started, I said, cultures and civilizations have their words of wisdom. So there's words of wisdom that are applicable to particular cultures and particular times. When I use the term, the invitation universally available, what I'm saying is that the wisdom that the book of Proverbs talks about is not tied to a particular culture. It's not tied to a particular time in history. It is universal. It is open to all who seek it. It's available to all. The words of wisdom in the book of Proverbs apply across all cultures. It applies across all times. Okay? And that appeal seems to come through here in these first 10 verses. It's an appeal to all. Whether you're what you think is the smartest one, or maybe you think that you're not necessarily the smartest one, whether you are the rich or whether you're the poor, it doesn't make any difference. And in particular, the reason why he says you ought to consider this, the reason that all ought to consider this wisdom is because it has another appeal. And I use the word appeal here in a different meaning. It's not an appeal in the sense of that which is beckons, but an appeal is to that which is appealing to us. That which, if you can say, beckons us and say, this is of interest to me. So you see that in verse 6. Look, all utterances of my mouth are righteousness. There's nothing crooked or perverted in them. Righteousness is seen in the book of Proverbs not merely as abstract concepts. Righteousness and justice are seen as virtues that are in relationships of people to people. And what he's saying is that this wisdom ought to appeal to you because it doesn't take one person and grant to them a privilege, grant to them an inside way. It's not something that appeals and doesn't deliver. This wisdom is genuine wisdom. And people can't pervert it. It doesn't distort it. It doesn't take advantage of you. I don't know about you, but we get to a point now where we have to decipher messages from people. We're entering a political season already. And you start to ask, is this person really seeking our interest, or are they seeking their own interest? See, are they saying the things that appeal to me, that sound good, but really aren't authentic, really aren't genuine, really aren't sincere, really aren't righteous at all, because they're self-centered? Wisdom says, the kind of wisdom I give, you can count on it, that it's not self-serving. It really is genuine. There's nothing crooked or perverted. It's straightforward. What it says, it means. And what it means, it says. And look, it's better, this wisdom is better than any wealth that you can attain. This way of wisdom will satisfy you for life. And ultimately, not just this life, but the life to come, will deliver and satisfy greater than anything that you think money can buy. And so wisdom is universally available. There's an appeal to all, and then there's the appeal of wisdom itself. Then in verse 12, he changes to verse 12 to 21. And he says, wisdom now is universally applicable. It applies to all. It applies to all, and he says, look, I, wisdom, dwell with prudence. That's sensible behavior. I find knowledge and discretion. Discretion is clear-headed thinking. It's not reserved for the elite. They don't have the corner on wisdom. But it's the kind of wisdom that even rulers exercise. Well, at least some of them. By me, good rulers. And there's much in the book of Proverbs about the heart of kings. Rulers decree justice. Princes rule the nobles. I love those who love me. Now, when he says the idea of universally applicable, what he's saying is that these Proverbs provide for us a guidebook, again, for whoever you are, a guidebook for life. A guidebook for life. A moral compass for conducting your life. And these Proverbs apply across the grain of life. So, one of the difficulties in working through the book of Proverbs, even finding a particular theme, is that Proverbs deals with so many subjects. Okay? I went back and looked, and because we were doing a child dedication this morning, and looked to something I did, I don't know, a number of years ago. I was asked to speak to social workers in Bermuda. Social workers and caseworkers who worked with children. And I you know what I did? I took the book of Proverbs because the subject was helping them help parents. So I took the book of Proverbs and said, look, we all want to be wise and give wisdom to parents. And we ought to consider the sources of wisdom. Well, one of the greatest sources of wisdom is the Bible. So here's the book of Proverbs. So let's look at the book of Proverbs and look at the principles of wisdom for child rearing, for parenting. And we just basically, in a secular setting, just went through and showed them principles for child rearing. Maxims for parenting. You'll find them here in the book of Proverbs. You'll find things about running a business. You say, really? Yeah, there are principles for running a business here in the book of Proverbs. For work. There are principles there about marriage. How to live in relationship between husband and wife. Hey guys, what do you always do on May, that second Sunday in May? Somebody inevitably talks about Proverbs 31. Are you a Proverbs 31 wife? Okay. Proverbs talks about relationships. Relationships, husbands and wives, parents and children, business. It talks about how we conduct ourselves in conversation. How do you speak? Do you get angry? Do you understand that a gentle answer turns away wrath? But an answer that responds in anger just drives the temperature up. Do you understand? The book of Proverbs talks about money. The book of Proverbs talks about friendship. So it really cuts across the grain of all areas of our life, because wisdom is life, knowledge, and experience. with a moral underpinning. We're going to get to that in a minute. How do I relate to life? How do I relate to those in my life? How do I conduct myself in relationships of life? That's what Proverbs does for us. And so it's universally applicable. It applies to all areas. And again, to princes and rulers and kings. And doesn't necessarily mean that kings are Christians. But they can seek wisdom. There are principles on how they are to exercise their rule. The last, verse 22, is this section that many interpreters will look at and say, oh, this is speaking of Jesus. See, from everlasting I was established in the beginning of the earliest times. I was there of creation, and I was there. That must be speaking of Christ. No, it's not. Okay, so be careful. One of the great heretics of the early church loved this passage and applied it to Christ. His name was Arius, who didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God in the sense of being the eternal Son of God. Arianism is still around today. They come knocking on your door, usually on Saturdays. Okay? Jehovah's Witnesses. And they'll go to this passage, and they'll try to use this passage to show you that Jesus was created, see? It's not speaking of Jesus. It's speaking of wisdom. Wisdom now takes on a personal identity and begins to speak. And this section, I think, is critical to understanding what real wisdom is. Because wisdom here is marked as an attribute of God. This real wisdom is an attribute of the divine. It belongs to God. And he frames it in the terms of creation. That God used wisdom. God exercised wisdom when he created the heavens and the earth. So what's significant through this section, if you read through there's some wonderful, again, poetic language. Verse 28, when he made firm the skies above, when the springs of the deep became fixed, and when he set for the sea its boundary, so the water wouldn't transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, I was beside him as a master workman. I was God's fellow worker. Again, personified, saying, look, God did all that he did in creation with me. Wisdom. This wisdom, this is what sets biblical wisdom apart. The wisdom that the book of Proverbs talks about is not an earthly wisdom. This wisdom that the book of Proverbs talks about is now set apart by talking about where it's from. Its origin. Where does real wisdom come from? Well, it must come from God. Real wisdom must have existed before time. Real wisdom existed before space. So wisdom, this wisdom that we're talking about, is not contingent upon your culture. See? This wisdom is not dependent upon where you live or when you live. That's why it's universal in its appeal. It's universal in its appeal because it comes from a God who is eternal. And so you can't unlock the secrets of the universe by using a key that's fashioned by human ingenuity or human wisdom. I know one of the main things this week that was in the news was they haven't used this term, but it'll come. They found the missing links this week. Do you know that? Somewhere in South Africa, they found another species of humans. Now, does that make sense to you? They found another species of humans. If you're not a human species, what are you? Okay, you're not human. Okay, so this is going to tell us. This is going to unfold for us the secrets. This is going to tell. So they're going to apply human wisdom to try to understand all the history of mankind. Really? Without the wisdom of God, you will not be able to put together the history of mankind. Because man is made in the image of God. Man is fashioned by God. You can't unpack it. You can't unlock it apart from the wisdom that comes from God. So that's why when you go back to Proverbs chapter 1. Proverbs chapter 1. As Solomon, I think, writes the introduction. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, verse 1. Gets us to verse 7, which really then sets the theme for the rest of the book, where we've been talking about today. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Where does wisdom come from? Wisdom comes from a right understanding of who God is. Wisdom comes from understanding who God is. I didn't say comprehending all that God is. But wisdom comes from understanding the nature of God, because God himself is wise. The fear of the Lord, not only having a proper knowledge and understanding of who God is, but having a right relationship with God. The fear of God. I know who he is. I understand based on what he's revealed concerning himself, and now I stand in a relationship to him. So that I understand that this world and how I relate to it is because there's a God who has granted me wisdom through what he has revealed concerning himself and what he's revealed concerning what he's doing in his world. I can walk this world. So how does that play out? Let me give you an illustration. Go to the book of James. James chapter 1. I know you've quoted this. I have quoted it often. Okay? Verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach will be given to him. Okay? All right. You ever quoted that verse? Sure, we all do. Okay? God, I don't know what to do. I don't know whether to look for a new job or not. I don't know whether to take this job. I don't know whether to go live here. I don't know where to send my kids to school. I don't know what. I don't know. But I know you say this. Lord, if I ask for wisdom, you'll give it to me. Right? And there is certainly an element of truth to that. But that wisdom really comes from the guidance of the Spirit of God. The wisdom that James is talking about is this. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Now what's the context of wisdom here? Lord, when I'm walking through life and life gets very, very difficult and I have a hard time figuring out how I'm going to respond to what's going on in my life, how am I going to respond to the things of life that are hard? If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. Why do you ask God for wisdom? Because God is the one who is leading you through your life with wisdom. God is all wise. God, grant me your wisdom so that I know you, so that I know how you're dealing with me and how you're dealing with the world, and to know how to relate. How do I relate to very difficult circumstances? How do I relate to difficult people? I want to respond, God, in the way that you would have me respond that's reflective of your wisdom. Turn to chapter 3. Verse 13. Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, don't be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom isn't that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, and demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there's disorder and every evil thing. When I seek wisdom to try to understand the circumstances and the hard things of life, instead of getting bitter, instead of getting angry, or when people do things to me, how I respond to them. And that might be the way the world responds. That may be the way Donald Trump responds. You attack me and I'll attack you back. That's earthly wisdom. And the result of earthly wisdom is chaos. But the wisdom from above is first pure and peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy, good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. See, there's a moral element to it. The wisdom that comes from God in dealing with difficult circumstances and difficult people, to know how to relate to them, creates in me a different response. Because ultimately, if I go back to James chapter 1, every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. If he's a God of wisdom, then God will take me through life and grant me his wisdom to know how to respond. Lots of times people, and I don't want to be curt and I don't want to be rude, they'll come and say, well, I need wisdom on this. And I say, well, I'm praying to God for wisdom. I said, have you read the book of Proverbs? Because God's already given you the wisdom. The wisdom's already there. God has already spoken it. He's already given it to us. Problem is, we don't think it's wise. Problem is, lots of times we're trusting in a human wisdom. Here's an exercise for you. I know many of you practice it. 31 chapters of Proverbs. Guess what? You know what's coming. Read a chapter a day. A chapter away keeps the folly away. Okay? Read it. Wisdom. You have kids? Have your kids read with you. I remember there was a season that I took Jonathan out and we had him work through the Proverbs, and we'd go out and talk about what he had read in Proverbs. I have to be careful what I say when your kids come here to church. When our kids were older and were starting to go out, and they went off to college, Dad's parting words to them on their way out the door is, be wise. Be wise. I can't control their actions. I can't control what they do when they are away from me. But I can remind them to be wise. To know how to relate to those around them. To know how to relate to their circumstances. But most importantly, to know how to relate to the God who grants wisdom. Teach your kids wisdom. As you work through the book of Proverbs, that's what Solomon does. Hey, sons, come, listen to me. Listen, listen, listen. Listen to your dad. Listen to your mom. Listen to wisdom. And he shares it. Help them relate to life. But help them to know that in order to do that, they have to understand and relate to the God who gives wisdom. Chapter 8 ends with this, with the conclusion. Therefore, O sons, listen to me. Blessed are they who keep my ways. Heed instruction, be wise, don't neglect it. Blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting. Seek wisdom. Want to know wisdom. For he who finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. But he who sins against me injures himself, and all those who hate me love death. The way of wisdom is the way of life. The way of the fool is the way of death. Pursue it. Don't neglect it. Listen to it. Read through Proverbs. Very, very applicable to wherever you are, whoever you are, to whatever your circumstances in life. God, the all-wise one, is giving us wisdom.